That night started like any other, but something in the air felt strange long before anyone noticed the danger. The sky above the research outpost had been dark all evening, but darkness wasn't unusual on that remote world. The clouds moved differently, though slow, heavy, and carrying a weight that made the wind colder than normal. She felt it the moment she stepped outside after her shift. She often stayed late around the hatchling nursery because she liked watching them settle down for the night. They were small, warm creatures with soft scales, and they always responded to her gentle voice, even when they didn't understand her words. She stood outside the nursery dome for a while, listening to the wind glide across the metal railings. It made a low, whistling sound she had never heard before. The sky flashed faintly, but not like normal lightning. It was more like the clouds were glowing from within for a second at a time. She narrowed her eyes, confused, but before she could think too much about it, her wrist device buzzed. It was a short message from the weather station, something about a storm forming faster than expected. They wanted everyone indoors soon, but they didn't sound too alarmed. Storms happened on that world, and usually the outpost was strong enough to handle them. Still, something inside her whispered that tonight wouldn't be normal. She made her way inside the nursery dome to check on the hatchlings one last time before going to her quarters. The warm light inside greeted her, and the smell of heated sand filled the air. The hatchlings were gathered close to the warmers, most of them curled up, their tiny wings tucked in. Their little chirps echoed softly, creating a calm feeling that always made her smile. She walked through the habitat slowly, checking their scanners, making sure their heat levels were fine, and then crouched near the smallest one, who always seemed a bit nervous at night. When she held out her hand, the little creature pressed its head gently against her palm, like it trusted her more than anyone else. Outside, the wind picked up enough to make the dome walls vibrate. She glanced over her shoulder. The storm hadn't even fully arrived, but the pressure in the air kept dropping. She could feel it in her ears, the way people do when a storm is forming over the sea back on Earth. Her instincts tightened. She gave the hatchlings one last look, promising quietly, "I'll be back soon." Even though she didn't plan for anything to happen. As she stepped out of the dome, a cold blast hit her so hard she shivered. The lights along the pathway flickered once, then again. The ground vibrated lightly under her boots. At first she thought it was her imagination, but no, the vibration was real. A small tremor, almost like something deep underground, was shifting. She looked toward the river, though she couldn't see it in the darkness. Only the faint roar of wind reached her ears, but underneath it, she heard a distant rushing sound that hadn't been there before. She tried telling herself that the river always made noise during storms, but she couldn't shake the thought that this time was different. While she walked back toward her quarters, her wrist device buzzed again, more urgently this time. It wasn't a calm warning now. The message was short, sharp, and filled with codes she wasn't used to seeing. Unexpected flood rise, flash level severity, immediate shelter required. Her breath caught. Flooding wasn't common in their region. The river was usually calm, slow-moving, almost lazy. For it to rise so fast, something massive had changed. Before she could think, an alarm echoed across the outpost. A long, deep siren, different from fire alarms or structural warnings. This one was rare. She had only heard it once during training. It meant there wasn't time to think. People had to move immediately. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Everyone would be heading to emergency shelters now, and she should have done the same. But as she turned toward the main shelter building, she froze again. A high-pitched sound came from behind her, not from the storm, not from equipment, but from the nursery dome. A faint, panicked hatchling cry. Her stomach twisted. The nursery's walls weren't built to withstand heavy flooding. They were strong, but not against massive water pressure. And the hatchlings? They were too young to know what to do, too weak to fly, too small to escape. She turned back without hesitation and ran. Each step splashed as rain finally began falling hard, cold droplets hitting the ground with force. The pathway lights flickered again, and for a moment she had to rely on the faint glow from the dome's emergency strips. When she reached the entrance, the ground shook again stronger than before, and the rumbling sound of water grew louder. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The hatchlings were chirping loudly, not from hunger or restlessness, but fear. A few of them tried climbing onto the warmers. Some hid under the feeding trays, and others huddled together tightly. The temperature inside had dropped because the power line flickered. She approached the main habitat area, whispering softly, trying to calm them. But the fear in their sounds made her own chest tighten. A loud thud made her jump. Water crashed against the outer barrier of the dome, forcing the metal to creak. Her eyes widened. The river must have already risen high enough to hit the base of the structure. Faster than she imagined. Much faster than any warning reported. She rushed to the control panel and tried sending a distress signal. But the screen blinked, connection lost. The communication tower must have been hit by lightning or wind. She swallowed hard. That meant no help would reach her soon. Maybe not at all until the storm passed. Another crash hit the outside wall, this time stronger. A thin trail of water trickled in through the ventilation seams. She felt panic rise in her throat, but she forced it down. Fear wouldn't help her, or the hatchlings. She moved quickly now. Gathering emergency supplies, she remembered from her training, a flotation net, a heat preserver bag, a small portable beacon, insulating wraps. She hung the net across her chest so she could keep the hatchlings close if the water level rose. A deeper, stronger rumble made the lights flicker until they went completely dark for a moment. When they came back, they were dimmer. She didn't know how much time she had. She looked at the hatchlings again. Their scales glowed faintly in fear, their tiny bodies trembling. Every sound outside told her the river was already forcing its way toward them. She had a choice. Try to move them all alone through the storm to the higher shelter building, or stay inside and hope the dome survived. But she knew the truth. The dome wouldn't last. She could feel the pressure building in every groan of the walls. "I'm right here," she whispered to the hatchlings, though her own hands shook. "I won't leave you." She began placing the smallest ones into the flotation net, speaking to them softly, the way she always did during nightly checkups. Her voice was the only steady thing in the chaos. One by one, they settled down, trusting her completely. Outside, thunder cracked so loud the dome floor vibrated. The storm had reached full strength. She knew there was no more time to think. The river was coming. The flood was coming. And she was the only line of defense these tiny lives had. With a deep breath, she tightened the straps around her shoulders, secured the beacon, and stepped toward the exit as the first wave of floodwater slammed into the dome wall hard enough to make the entire structure shake. She didn't know what waited for her outside, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She would not let a single hatchling drown tonight, not if she could still move, not if she could still breathe, not as long as she was alive. The moment she stepped outside the nursery dome, the storm struck with a force she had not expected. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, so thick that it blurred everything only a few steps away. The wind pushed against her so hard, she had to lean her body forward just to stay balanced. The hatchlings inside the flotation net chirped softly, sensing the danger, but trusting the warmth of her body and the steady rhythm of her breaths. She held the net close to her chest as she moved along the pathway. The ground was already covered with flowing water, not deep yet, but fast enough to make each step careful. The lights that lined the path flickered constantly, and some had shut off completely, leaving patches of darkness she had to navigate through, using the faint glow of her handheld beacon. Every sound around her felt louder and sharper than normal. The wind howled like something alive, throwing debris across the outpost. The metal roofs of nearby buildings rattled, as if they might lift off at any moment. Deep in the distance, she heard the rushing roar of the river, louder than she had ever heard it before. It wasn't the sound of water flowing. It was the sound of water crashing. She whispered softly to the hatchlings, the way someone might soothe a frightened infant. She didn't know if they understood her words, but they responded to her voice, their chirps turning quieter. She kept walking, one careful step after another, trying to reach the higher ground where the main emergency shelter was built. But the moment she reached the halfway point, the world shifted around her. A trembling vibration rippled through the ground, and before she could react, a wave of muddy water rushed across the path from the left side, striking her legs. It wasn't high enough to knock her down, but it was strong enough to freeze her in place. She tightened her grip on the net, her heart jumping in her chest. The water hadn't come from the river directly. It had forced its way through the old drainage channels that usually protected the outpost. The channels must have overflowed completely. She slowly backed up, keeping her body sideways so the water flow wouldn't push her off balance. Another surge followed, stronger than the first, splashing up to her knees. She looked around quickly. The path to the emergency shelter was already blocked. The water was moving too fast, carrying debris, broken branches, metal scraps, even pieces of equipment from storage units. Trying to walk through that would put the hatchlings in danger. She couldn't risk it. She turned around and headed toward the secondary shelter, a smaller place used for equipment storage, but built on slightly higher ground. It wasn't ideal, and it didn't have full emergency systems, but it was a safer option than trying to cross through rising floodwater. As she made her way to the side path, the storm grew stronger. The wind pushed against her so fiercely that she sometimes had to stop and brace herself. The rain felt colder, sharper, as if the temperature had dropped quickly. The lights above her blinked off entirely now, plunging the entire path into near darkness. Only the soft, blue light of her portable beacon lit the way. The hatchlings stirred nervously in the net. She tightened her arms around them, murmuring softly, "I know, I know. I'm right here." Her voice was steady, even though her heart felt like it was pounding against her ribs. Another rumble came from the river, louder than anything before. She glanced toward the far side of the outpost, where the river usually flowed. Even though she could only see shadows and storm flashes, she knew the water level must have risen dangerously high. The river wasn't just overflowing, it was breaking its boundaries. She reached the smaller side path that led toward the storage shelter. The path wound behind the research huts and maintenance area. This section of the outpost was older and not used often, so the lighting and drainage weren't as strong. The moment she stepped into it, she felt the uneven ground beneath her feet and heard rushing water echoing weirdly between metal walls. She walked faster, careful not to slip. The floodwater here wasn't as deep, but it was unpredictable. It formed pools that hid dips in the ground, making it easy to stumble. She kept one hand against the wall of a building to steady herself. Suddenly, a loud metallic crash echoed behind her. She whipped around, heart in her throat, but it was just a loose panel blown off a roof and slammed by the wind. It skidded across the ground before lodging itself against a fence. Even though she knew it wasn't alive, the sudden noise made her breath stop for a moment. The hatchlings reacted too, their chirps rising sharply. She spoke to them again, her voice warm but gentle. She had always been good with them. Even before this night, the hatchlings seemed to recognize her steps, her smell, her presence. Tonight, That bond mattered more than ever. She reached the old storage shelter door and pushed it open. It resisted at first mud, and water had piled against it, but with a firm shove, it moved enough for her to slip inside. The moment she entered, the sound of the storm grew softer, as if someone had placed a thick blanket over the world. The shelter wasn't warm, but at least the wind was no longer trying to knock her down. She set the beacon on the floor so its light filled the small room. It wasn't much, just a few metal shelves, old tools, and a raised platform used for sorting equipment. But it was dry for now, and that was all that mattered. She gently lowered the net onto the raised platform so the hatchlings could rest. She checked each one, making sure none were too cold or breathing unevenly. Their scales felt cool, but they responded quickly when she wrapped them in insulating cloth and rubbed warmth into them with her hands. Outside, the storm continued to roar. Water slapped against the building walls. The metal roof rattled, but it held. She listened to the sounds, trying to understand the rhythm of the storm, hoping it would calm soon. But the more she listened, the more she realized it was only getting worse. She couldn't stay in this shelter forever. The water might rise here too. The building wasn't as strong as the main structures. If the storm grew stronger, this place might not hold. She sat down on the floor, leaning her back against the shelves. Her clothes were soaked from the rain, and every muscle in her body ached from fighting the wind and water. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe deeply. She wasn't afraid for herself, but she worried about the hatchlings. If the water reached this far, she would have to move them again, maybe deeper into the outpost, maybe even toward the elevated service tower, the highest structure they had. She opened her eyes again and checked the hatchlings. Some were sleeping, exhaustion taking over. Others were awake, but calm now that they were dry and close to her. The faint glow from their scales reflected softly against the metal walls, giving the room a strange, peaceful light. She took in that small moment of calm. But deep inside, she knew it wouldn't last long. A sudden, heavy knock hit the back wall of the shelter. Not like debris this time, but like a force of water pressing hard. She stood quickly, her heart jumping. She touched the wall gently and felt a faint vibration. The water level outside was rising. Not minutes from now. Not soon. Now. She took a slow breath, steadying her thoughts. There was no room for panic. Not here, not tonight. She had already made her choice when she first stepped out into the storm. She would stay with the hatchlings until every one of them was safe. The storm was strong, maybe stronger than anything the outpost had ever seen. But she wasn't backing down. She adjusted the straps of the flotation net, checked the beacon's battery, and prepared herself once more, because the flood wasn't done rising, and her rescue mission had only just begun. The water kept rising outside the small storage shelter, and every sound reminded her that time was running out. She stood still for a moment, listening carefully, trying to understand how quickly the flood was climbing. The hatchlings were quiet now, as if they could sense her tension. Their tiny bodies huddled together on the raised platform, and their soft breaths filled the air with a faint warmth. She knew she couldn't wait much longer. The shelter was safer than the open path, but it wasn't strong enough to withstand a full flood. If the water reached the windows, it would seep in through the cracks. If it reached the door, it could push hard enough to force it open. She looked around the room again, taking in the shelves, the tools, the crates. None of it gave her comfort. What did give her comfort were the hatchlings. Their trust in her felt like a responsibility she was ready to carry, no matter how difficult the storm became. She lifted the flotation net again and gently placed the hatchlings back inside. Some protested with soft chirps, not wanting to leave the small bit of warmth they had found, but they settled quickly when they recognized her hands. She wrapped insulating cloth around the smallest ones, making sure they wouldn't get cold once they were back in the rain. She opened the door of the shelter slowly. A strong gust of wind pushed it back immediately, and she had to use her shoulder to keep it from slamming shut. The sound of the storm felt louder now, almost like it waited for her. The air outside was colder than before, making her face sting the moment she stepped out. The water on the ground had risen to her shins. It wasn't just rainwater anymore. She could feel the strength of the current pulling at her boots. She tightened her grip on the net, secured the beacon to her chest, and took her first step into the swirling water dot. Each step was becoming harder. The path she had taken earlier was nearly invisible now. Mud and water blended into one dark, restless surface, making it impossible to see where the ground dipped or where debris might be hiding. She moved slowly, keeping her feet wide apart, letting her body lean into the current rather than fighting it directly. The hatchlings chirped softly from the net, their sounds trembling but steady. She whispered back to them, "It's okay. I'm right here." Her voice was firm, calmer than she felt inside. Approaching the main path again, she paused. The river's roar had become even louder. When she looked toward the far end of the outpost, she saw flashes of white water leaping above the usual river boundary. Shapes moved in the distance, logs, pieces of the old wooden walkway, and other debris carried by the flood. She couldn't take the main path anymore. It was completely underwater and unstable. The current there would be far too strong. She had to move through the intersection of the outpost, weaving between buildings, climbing over obstacles if necessary, and finding a way toward higher ground. She turned left, toward a cluster of maintenance structures. These buildings were sturdier and had raised foundations. If she could reach the walkway behind them, she could follow it toward the elevated service tower. It was not meant for living creatures, but it was the safest high structure in the entire outpost. Someone had once joked that if the world ever flooded, the service tower would be the last thing above water. Tonight. She hoped that joke would be true. The storm wind pushed against her steadily, and the rain soaked her clothes until her jacket felt heavy and cold. The weight made her movements slower, but she kept going. The hatchlings depended on her. Their lives were too small and delicate to survive this on their own. She reached the first maintenance building and placed one hand on its wall for guidance. The water rose to her knees now, swirling with more force. She pressed her back against the structure whenever a strong wave came through, letting it pass before she took another step. At one point, the beacon light flickered as a splash of cold water hit it. She froze, scared it might go out. Losing the light would make everything much harder. She lifted the beacon higher and covered it with one hand for a moment until it steadied. When the light returned to its soft glow, she let out a shaky breath of relief. She continued moving, but then she noticed a faint chirping not coming from the net. It was distant, carried by the wind, almost lost in the storm's roar. She stopped walking and listened carefully. She heard it again, a tiny, desperate sound. Her heart tightened. It was another hatchling. She looked around quickly. It couldn't be from her net. All the hatchlings inside were accounted for and safe. That meant one must have been swept away earlier, maybe before she had reached the nursery dome. Maybe it had been caught in the first wave of water that broke through the lower rooms. She turned toward the direction of the sound. It was faint, coming from deeper within the maintenance area, near one of the old storage yards where unused equipment was kept. She hesitated. The water there would be deeper. The path would be riskier. But she couldn't ignore the sound. "Just stay with me," she whispered to the hatchlings in the net. And then she carefully stepped off the main route. The ground sloped downward slightly, and the water rose quickly around her legs, reaching almost to her thighs. She moved slowly, feeling with her feet before shifting her weight. A floating crate bumped into her, and she pushed it aside with her elbow, careful not to let it knock her off balance. The chirping grew clearer. It echoed from somewhere near a fallen piece of machinery. As she approached, she lowered the beacon to illuminate the area better. The beam of light revealed a collapsed storage rack, half submerged. Something small and pale clung to one of the metal bars, a lone hatchling. Shivering and trying to keep its head above the water. Her chest tightened at the sight. The tiny creature was exhausted, its movements weak, its chirps fading. She moved closer, water splashing at her waist now. She stretched her hand out, speaking softly so it wouldn't panic. The hatchling blinked slowly, recognizing the warmth of her voice. She leaned forward carefully, bracing her body against the machinery so the current wouldn't pull her away. With slow, steady movements, she slid her arm under the hatchling, lifting it gently from the cold water. The creature curled into her palm instantly, trembling in exhaustion. She tucked it into the warm cloth lining of the flotation net, rubbing its back lightly until its breathing steadied. The other hatchlings chirped softly, welcoming the new one as she secured the net again. She turned back toward the path to the service tower. The detour had taken time, and the water around her felt deeper and stronger. But saving that one hatchling was worth every moment. As she made her way forward again. The lights of the outpost behind her flickered one last time before shutting off completely. The storm had taken out the main power grid. The only light left now came from her beacon and the faint glow of the hatchlings' scales. She took a deep breath and looked ahead. The walkway leading to the service tower was still a long distance away, and the storm continued to grow stronger. But she didn't let fear settle in her heart. She still had strength. She still had purpose. And most importantly, she still had every hatchling alive in her care. With steady steps, she walked forward into the rising flood, ready to face whatever the storm brought next. The water kept rising as she made her way toward the part of the outpost where the elevated service tower stood. She could barely see the tower through the blur of rain and wind, but its tall outline appeared every time lightning flashed across the sky. It stood like a dark pillar in the storm, unmoving, untouched by the flood, almost like it was waiting for her. Her legs were tired, far more tired than she wanted to admit. Each step felt heavier now, as if the storm itself was pulling her back. Her jacket clung to her like a second skin, soaked and cold, and her hair was plastered across her forehead and cheeks. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the chill in the air. Yet she kept the flotation net close, always checking to make sure none of the hatchlings were slipping or getting too cold. She talked to them more now. Every few minutes, she whispered something, anything, just so they could hear her voice. "We're almost there. You're doing so well. Just a little longer?" Sometimes the hatchlings responded with tiny chirps, weak but grateful, like they understood she was fighting the whole storm for them. The path became steeper as she approached the maintenance elevators near the base of the tower. The floodwater couldn't climb the slope as fast, but that didn't make it easier. The wind was stronger here, hitting her from the side instead of the front. It pushed her off balance more than once, forcing her to brace herself against whatever she could reach: a fence post, a railing, the corner of a building. A loud cracking sound echoed above her. She looked up sharply, terrified something was about to fall. But it was just a metal panel from a nearby roof, snapping off and spinning into the wind before crashing somewhere out of sight. The noise made her heart jump, but there was no time to stop. She hugged the net closer and kept moving. When she reached the main crosswalk that led toward the tower base, she stopped. The walkway was still above water, but not by much. In some places, the water lapped over the edge, spilling across small sections like restless fingers trying to grab hold. The railings shook from the wind, rattling against their bolts. She took a breath, placed one foot on the walkway and tested its stability. It held. She stepped fully onto it, feeling the wind shove her sideways immediately. She gripped the railing with one hand to steady herself, her knuckles turning white from the effort. The hatchling stirred at the sudden movement, and she whispered, "I've got you. I won't let you fall." Slowly, step by careful step, she crossed the walkway. Lightning flashed repeatedly now, lighting up the sky in long streaks that looked like cracks spreading across the clouds. In those bright moments, she could see the full force of the storm trees bending dangerously, water swirling around building corners, distant structures half submerged. The entire outpost looked different, like a world she no longer recognized. Halfway across the walkway, she felt the structure shake beneath her feet. Not from something hitting it, but from the wind itself. She stopped, breathing hard. A strong gust slammed into her side, making her lean heavily against the railing. Her feet slid a little on the wet surface, and she quickly stabilized herself before she could slip further. "Not now," she whispered, almost like she was talking to the storm. "Please, not now." She waited for the gust to pass, then continued moving, even slower than before. The tower was only a few meters away, now so close she could see the ladder rungs on its base. The final platform before the tower entrance was slightly higher and narrower, but as long as she got there, she would be safe from the flood. When she finally stepped off the walkway and onto the base platform, she almost collapsed from relief. Her legs shook from the effort of staying upright against the storm. She leaned against the tower wall for a moment, letting her breathing steady. The hatchlings huddled closer in the net, their tiny bodies pressing into each other for warmth. She looked up at the tower entrance. It had a maintenance door that led to an interior staircase, spiraling upward toward the upper floors. She had climbed it before, during regular inspections. Inside, the structure was stable, warm, and safe from the wind. If she could get inside and climb even 2 or 3 levels up, the flood wouldn't be able to reach them. Her hand shook as she typed the emergency access code into the door panel. At first, the screen flickered, then dimmed, and she worried that the storm might have cut the power to the tower. But a second later, the green light blinked, and the lock disengaged with a soft click. The sound felt like the first piece of good luck she'd had all night. She pushed the door open and stepped inside the narrow entrance hall. The wind noise softened immediately, and the cold eased just a little. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The silence that followed was heavy and strange, as if the tower had swallowed the world's chaos. The ground floor of the tower wasn't warm, but it was dry. Metal steps spiraled upward in a tight circle, and she reached out to touch the railing, just to feel something solid under her hands. She took one deep breath, then another. The hatchlings were safe for now, but she hadn't reached the end of the danger. The flood could rise higher. Heavy winds could shake the tower later. She needed to climb the stairs and find a secure room before thinking she could rest. She adjusted the net straps across her shoulders and started up the stairway. Each step felt steep, heavier than she remembered, and the metal beneath her boots rang softly with each movement. The stairwell echoed strangely, like the tower was listening to her every breath. She climbed one level, then a second, and a third. By the time she reached the 4th platform, her legs ached deeply. She felt warmth spread across her shoulders, not from the tower, but from the hatchlings pressed together inside the net. Their glow felt softer too, a gentle pulse of light that guided her in the dim stairwell. She found an unlocked utility room on the 4th level and stepped inside. It wasn't large, but it had emergency heaters along the walls, sealed cabinets, and a raised platform that could keep the hatchlings off the cold floor. She turned on the heater, and after a moment, warm air began to fill the room. She placed the net gently on the platform and loosened the straps. The hatchlings slowly crawled out, stretching their small wings and shaking off bits of water. She dried each one carefully with soft cloth, then wrapped them in warm covers. Some chirped softly, others curled up in small circles. Exhausted after the long ordeal, she sat beside them, her back against the wall, finally letting her tired body relax. For the first time all night, she didn't feel like she had to move immediately. She watched the hatchlings settle down, their tiny breaths slow and peaceful. The storm continued outside, but now it felt distant, like a fading roar that could no longer reach them. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't finished yet. She still had to wait out the storm, and she still needed a plan for what came after, but she had brought every hatchling to safety. Every single one, and she had done it alone, through darkness, flood, wind, and fear. She opened her eyes again, looking at the small creatures curled up together. Their faint glow warmed the room, and she felt something stir in her chest. A quiet, deep pride dot. She whispered softly, "You're safe now. I promised I wouldn't leave you." Outside, the flood might still be rising, but inside the tower, she finally allowed herself to rest, knowing part of the battle was behind her, and the final part was waiting for her tomorrow. The storm finally began to slow down, but the sky was still dark and heavy. The wind had lost some of its power, yet it still pushed against the half-broken walls of the outpost. Water kept dripping from every corner, and the echo of the night's chaos was still in the air. She stood inside the emergency shelter, soaked from head to toe, holding the bag where she had placed the rescued hatchlings. Her arms were shaking from exhaustion, but she didn't loosen her grip, not even for a second. Inside the shelter, soft heating panels started to glow, spreading gentle warmth across the room. The hatchlings made tiny sounds from inside the net bag, weak chirps, almost like whispers, but they were alive. That alone gave her enough strength to stay on her feet. She gently opened the bag one side at a time. The hatchlings were cold, but they were breathing. Their small bodies glowed faintly, their scales giving off a soft shimmer as the heat touched them. She checked each one with careful hands, trying her best not to disturb them too much. She counted them slowly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Every number she said felt like a small victory. When she reached the last hatchling, the one she had found far downstream, she paused for a long moment. That little one had held onto her finger earlier with such desperation, as if it understood that she was the only hope it had left. Now, seeing it breathe calmly, she felt her chest loosen a little. For the first time since the flood began, she allowed herself to take a deeper breath. She sat down on the floor, finally letting her tired legs rest. Her clothes were still dripping, forming a small puddle under her boots. She leaned her head back against the cold metal wall and closed her eyes, just for a moment. She didn't sleep, but she let her mind calm down. The sound of the hatchlings breathing softly around her felt like a lullaby after a night full of danger. Minutes slowly passed. The storm softened even more. The loud crashes of thunder became distant rumbles. The flashes of lightning came less often. She could hear something new outside voices, distant at first, then getting a bit clearer. Rescue teams were finally arriving. She tried to stand again, though her body felt heavier than ever. She gathered the hatchlings in warm blankets, placing them gently in a portable incubator. As she secured everything, the shelter door opened with a sharp hiss, and a group of emergency crew members entered. The first thing they saw was her drenched, tired, but still standing protectively over the incubator. One of them stepped forward with wide eyes, clearly shocked by the sight. "How did you?" he began, his voice trailing off as he looked at the number of hatchlings she had saved. She didn't answer right away. She simply nodded toward the incubator, as if telling them they're okay. That's all that matters. The emergency team quickly moved to check the hatchlings. Their expressions shifted from shock to relief. They had expected the worst. No one believed that so many tiny creatures could survive such a massive flood, and they definitely didn't expect one exhausted caretaker to bring them all out alive. More crew members entered, bringing lights, portable heaters, and medical supplies. They worked fast, trying to stabilize the room and make it safe. She stepped aside a little, letting them take over. Her body was still trembling, but she held herself steady. Outside the shelter, the world looked completely different. The sun was rising, though clouds still covered most of the sky. The ground was soaked and muddy. Trees had been pushed sideways by rushing water. Broken equipment was scattered everywhere. But there was also a strange sense of calm, like the land itself was finally taking a breath after fighting through the harsh night. She walked out slowly, leaning a little on the railing. Every step felt heavy, but she forced herself forward. Something inside her wanted to see the sky, even if it was covered in clouds. Maybe she just needed to see the end of the night with her own eyes. Not far from the shelter, several adult dragons had gathered. They were restless and worried. Their wings folded tightly against their bodies, and their eyes were glowing faintly in distress. They kept making low, rumbling sounds, looking toward the shelter door as if waiting for someone to come out. When they saw her step outside, they all went silent for a moment. Then, slowly, one of the dragons lowered its head, almost touching the ground, as if giving a quiet greeting or a thank you. She stopped walking, surprised by the gentle gesture. She wasn't expecting any recognition, especially not from creatures so strong and proud. Another dragon followed, lowering its head too. Then another. Soon, the whole group stood silently before her, bowing in their own way, expressing something that words could never explain. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. The sight touched her deeply, making her eyes sting with emotion. She managed a small smile and whispered, "They're safe. All of them." The rescue team behind her heard those words, and a few of them stopped working, staring in disbelief. They didn't need to check the incubator again. Her expression said everything. A senior officer approached her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did more than anyone could have expected," he said. "You saved every life that could be saved." She shook her head, brushing off the praise. "I just did what anyone would do," she replied quietly. But the officer knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would walk through dangerous floodwater alone, fight against strong currents, crawl through broken rooms, and risk their own life again and again. Not everyone would stay out there until the very last hatchling was found. Most people would stop when things became too risky. But she didn't. As the morning light finally grew brighter, the hatchlings were moved to a safer, drier facility. She followed the team slowly, watching them handle the little ones with the care they deserved. The hatchlings, now warm and recovering, chirped softly as they were placed under gentle lights. A few even tried to nudge toward her hand, recognizing the warmth they had felt during the night. The smallest one, the one she had saved, last kept turning its head in her direction. She touched its tiny nose carefully, smiling as it made a quiet sound. It was a bond that formed in the middle of chaos, a connection born from moments where both had depended on each other to survive. Later in the day, as the outpost staff moved around repairing damage and helping the rescue teams, she finally found a moment to sit alone near the edge of the landing bay. She watched the clouds shift slowly above the mountains, the storm fully gone now. The fresh air felt peaceful. She let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the night slowly lifting off her shoulders. She didn't think of herself as a hero. In her mind, she had only done what her heart told her to do, protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But the story of the night began spreading quickly across the outpost. People who walked by whispered to each other. Some stopped to ask if she was okay. Others simply looked at her with respect. By evening, the entire place was talking about her courage. Someone had already called her the guardian of the storm night. She laughed softly when she heard it, thinking it sounded far more dramatic than what she felt she had done. But she didn't argue. People needed something hopeful to talk about after such a hard night. The hatchlings recovered faster than anyone expected. They grew stronger with each hour, moving around their new warm space with small, careful steps. Whenever she visited, they looked up at her as if waiting for her to come closer. The adult dragons stayed calm now, often watching her with quiet understanding. They trusted her. They had sensed, in their own way, that she had protected their young with everything she had. As the day ended, she walked back to her quarters. The halls were still wet, and many lights were still flickering, but the place felt alive again. The fear of the night had faded, replaced with relief and gratitude. Before closing her door, she glanced back toward the incubation room one last time. Even from far away, she could hear faint chirps. The sound made her smile gently. She whispered to herself, "They made it. All of them." And that simple truth was enough to give her peace. The storm had tried to take everything, but her determination had saved every fragile life she could reach. The night would always be remembered, not as a night of destruction, but as a night of courage, hope, and the quiet strength of someone who refused to give up. It became a story people told over and over again. A story of how one person, standing alone in the middle of a deadly flood, chose to fight for the smallest lives and never stopped until every last hatchling was safe. And for her, that was all that mattered.